Hey folks, Chris Thoreau here from SeedLeaf, and in this tutorial I'm going to go in depth on our crops page. So you can see I've navigated to our crops page here, but I'm actually going to start on a different screen just to kind of go over some of the crop planning theory that we use here at SeedLeaf to run the program. So we're going to look at three things about crop planning, and that's the elements, the tasks, and the stages. So when we talk about the elements, we're talking about the seed, the crop, and the product. The seed is what we start with. We transform it into a crop, and when we harvest that crop, it becomes a product. So that's the general setting for what's driving our plan here. And then in SeedLeaf, we are generating tasks. We have soak and sow. Sow has now become sow and cover. We have moving to blackout. We have uncovering to light, and then we have harvesting. And it's the harvest that turns the crop into a product. But what we don't have in SeedLeaf, which is kind of in between all of these tasks, is the stages. And seeing this might help you understand how you format your crops and get them going. So there are basically two to three main stages in your crop growth, depending whether or not you use the blackout. And for this example, we're going to use the blackout stage, which is a new feature we've just added to SeedLeaf in July of 2022. So the first stage is our germination or wait stage. And in SeedLeaf, these are the days to germinate. And so that's this time period here. Then we have our blackout stage. This is usually when we remove the weight, but still keep the crop in darkness, often with an upside down tray on top. And this is the days in blackout item on your crop page. And then we have the light stage, which is the remainder of the cycle, which we don't name on SeedLeaf. But what we do have is the days to maturity. So the days to maturity is the full crop cycle. The first part of that crop cycle is your days to germinate. The second part of that crop cycle is days in blackout. And then the third stage is the light stage when they're uncovered completely. So this is what's driving what's happening in SeedLeaf. So with that, let's go take a look at the crops page and create a crop and see how this all looks in SeedLeaf. So I'm on the crops page. You can see I've got some crops here, but we're going to start from the beginning and add a new crop. So we're going to add a crop called sunflower. And you'll have to excuse me, the E button is not working on my keyboard. So we're going to do sunflower. I was going to call it sunflower 1020. This is the how I use the naming of the crop is the crop name and then the tray size that it's in. For seed, of course, we're going to use sunflower, black oil right there. Our seeding rate is 125 grams per tray. Our soak time is 120 minutes. And here you can see our items that we were talking about in terms of our tasks and stages. So that's why we're going to have 3 days to germinate. We're going to have 2 days in blackout. We're going to have 9 days to maturity. So you might have a cycle something like this. It might be 4 days in germination, might be 8 days to maturity. This is really going to vary depending how you grow your crop. And then we're going to put on our yield, which right now is about 600 grams per tray. So per 1020 tray, as you see, I've named it there. So now we've got all the information in there. If we were soaking the seed overnight, we would click this button. And that just means that the soak task will be on one day, probably in the evening, and then the sowing task will be on the next day, probably in the morning. But we don't overnight soak our sunflower, we just soak them for 120 minutes or 2 hours. And then we will add this crop. Now I've already got some sunflower in here, but I'm going to navigate back to this one. Sunflower 1020, you can see I had sunflower black oil 1020. So I'm just going to go back here because if I want to edit that crop, I just navigate back. Make any changes I want, be like, you know what, I think we're actually just 8 days to maturity, and then it's good to go. So just one thing to keep in mind is your days to germinate and your days in blackout are included in your days to maturity. So you're going to have 3 days to germinate, 2 days in blackout, and that's going to mean 3 days in the light. But we don't need to define our days in light because that's just what's left here. So, but those stages, because those stages aren't named, it's good to have a sense of that. As you saw, it's easy to go into a crop and simply edit it and save it, and that way we can make changes. Now, if I had already sowed this crop, what I've done is I've gone and changed the days to maturity. So this will change the day certain tasks take place on. So if you're ever making edits to your crop, just keep in mind at the moment when you make edits, it does change things. If I change the yield from 600 to 500, well, SeedLeaf is going to say, oh, well, if your yield is only 500, well, then you need to sow this many trays. It's going to want you to sow more trays. But if you've already sowed them, you can't make that change. So just keep that in mind. That's how the system is operating at the moment. So I'll save that. So you can also have an active or an archived crop. And so what I'm going to just do is go into Amaranth here, and I'm going to click this button. And this means Amaranth is an archived crop, which means I'm not growing Amaranth. I'm archiving it because I don't want to see it. And then when I come here, I just want to show my active. And that way, any stuff that's archived isn't going to show up. So this is a really easy way to have a whole bunch of crops in your database, but just have the crops that are active show up in your lists. And that means only the active crops are going to show up in your drop-down menus when you're creating products. So it keeps that large database of crops, but it means you only have to deal with the ones that are active. So that's a quick overview of crops. I hope that makes sense, and I hope you enjoy the new blackout feature as well.